What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and for those that already don't know, Fire Emblem is one of my favorite video game franchises. In fact, considering how much I like Fire Emblem, it's more or less considered one of my gaming special interests, alongside Pokemon. So, and since I already have like a Fire Emblem entry up already, well, it kind of makes sense. Why not make a video about something that most other people don't talk about all that much? Bosses. And such, maybe make my 14 favorite bosses list. So, that being said, it's time to count down my top 14 favorite Fire Emblem bosses. Now, the rules here are only one per game, and FE1, FE2, and FE3 aren't gonna be in this one, just only the remakes because I prefer them, and no final bosses because honestly, final bosses make things way too easy. Alright, so without further ado, let's get started. Alright, starting off first at number 14, we have the Four Hounds, Corrupted Hyacinth, and Evil Veil from Fire Emblem Engage. Yeah, we're starting this one off with the most recently released Fire Emblem entry. And considering how I played Fire Emblem Engage twice already, I actually like this game pretty much. However, the one thing I have to say is that most of the boss battles aren't too memorable. In fact, the only memorable bosses I can think of from Engage are a random throwaway boss that you face off against early in the game that returns later on, and the one Fire Emblem boss who is voiced by the same guy who voices Mugman from the Cuphead show. No joke, look it up. Nelucci from Fire Emblem Engage and Mugman from the Cuphead show share the same voice actor. So, anyway, all that aside, it was pretty hard to find a boss that I really enjoyed. But then comes Serenity in Chapter 17, Serenity in Ruin. And honestly, this one is one of the most... I can honestly say, and I understand why everyone loves this chapter, as it's one of the best ones that you've ever seen. And basically, not only do you face off against the Four Hounds, but this is after you discover that Veil really wasn't herself, and that most of those things that you mostly thought of Veil doing were all because of her evil self that was brought about by a spell. Basically, almost as a split personality. And not only that, but you're also facing off against the corrupted form of King Hyacinth. And the only time you face off against a corrupted form of a ruler of Helios previously was in fact King Morian of Protea, who basically is not too elegant in his corrupted form. But of course, yeah, not only do you have to face off against those six, but all six of them have access to all the emblem rings you collected before they were ceremoniously snatched away from you at the halfway point. And basically, it's just your old crop of emblem rings versus your newer crop of emblem rings. And honestly, it's kind of an interesting face-off when you think about it. Additionally, yeah, the fact that Veil after the battle happens, and Vale basically tricks Zephyr into giving her two of the emblem rings, basically the rings for Sigurd and I believe either Roy or Leaf, only to throw them to you to help you out. That was one of the best gambits I've ever seen in my life. And it's kind of an interesting salve considering the remaining bosses you face off against in the game. Yeah, really says a lot. Moving on next at number 13, we have Arik from Fire Emblem Fates. Alright, we're following up the most recent Fire Emblem entry with my favorite Fire Emblem entry. And considering how many times I've played Fates, especially Fire Emblem Fates Revelation being my favorite path, yeah, it's kind of hard to find a boss. Namely because my playthrough of Fire Emblem Fates Birthright yeah, honestly, I really couldn't figure that out. However, I had to figure out one of my favorites, and surprisingly enough, it comes courtesy of Revelations. Mainly because just a chapter after you as Corrin decide, nope, I am not siding with Hoshido or Nor. I'm taking the middle path. Azora basically leads Corrin and either Jacob or Felicia to jump off into the bottomless canyon and leading them into the kingdom of Vala, where not only, spoiler alert, do you find out that Gunter is still alive, but you meet a mysterious mage who tells you to leave. Yeah. Several chapters later, you eventually make the return trip into Vala, where, surprise, surprise, you come across a mysterious mage, who is honestly revealed to be Azora's mother, Arik. Granted, you do face off against her 3 times, but I'm choosing Chapter 22, Memories. Because basically you're more or less heading through a forest and trying to find ways to get to Arik at the end. Of course, you either have one of 2 ways. You go around the sides, which will basically take longer, or you just step on a dragon vein and more or less clear cut your way through the forest. And basically you're facing off against many different enemies, including random faceless who have the skill Immobilized in order just to freeze you in place. Yeah. She basically is tough. But of course, even if you do face off against Arik, she will make sure you suffer. Of course, that being said, she's also kinda easy to face off against. Especially if you're packing Ryoma, because Ryoma plus Raijinto plus Astra is broken. At least I don't have... Never mind. Moving on next at number 12, we have Macbeth from FE4, Genealogy of the Holy War. Alright. For those that are already wondering why FE4 is a boss from FE4 is this low on the list, let's just be real. The chapters and the maps in this game are long. And it's kind of obvious that in any given chapter, you're facing off up to 3 or 4 bosses. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And that being said, chapter 2, you end up. That's how many bosses you face off against. Like 4. Including one who sends his son to take over Nornian, mainly because he has a thing for Lachesis, which she doesn't reciprocate. And a guy who basically, he is so opportunistic, he doesn't join the fray until he knows which one of them are gonna come out on top. And then there's a man who's named after the Scottish play, which anyone out there who was a theater kid growing up, or has a love of theater in general, they know why I called him the guy named after the Scottish play. This guy is even more of an opportunist, mainly because he sends his cronies to raid nearby villages. I mean, thankfully you have Lewin and Sylvia showing up to help out. But yeah, if you don't save them in time, you'll lose out on some very crucial items. And even after you defeat the first guy and his son Elliot, yeah, Macbeth basically just sends out more mercenaries towards you, including in another one of your recruitable units, Beowulf, and his buddy Waltz. And even if you do get past Waltz and his boys and recruit Beowulf as a result, he's basically pretty hard to face off against since he's a general with Pavis. Granted, again, you have Azel or Lewin who could take him down easily, but it's gonna take some time. Really does say a lot. Moving on next at number 11, we have Ludwig from Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. Oh boy. Yeah, I know most people are wondering why I'm not putting the Black Knight from Part 4 on this list, or even Jared from Part 1. Well, honestly, Black Knight is also a little too easy, and Jared, well, honestly, you really think I'd put Jared on this list? That being said, Part 2, most people don't pay attention to Part 2 because not only is it so short, but honestly, it's sandwiched right between Part 1 and Part 3, which really does say a lot. However, considering how Ludwig has been a thorn in Princess Elincia's side, basically as an upstart noble trying to wrest control of Crimea from her, yeah, honestly, it really does say a lot. However, that being said, things really come to a head when Lucia has been captured and is slated to be executed for whatever reason. Granted, that being said, basically this leads you to face off against Ludwig and his fighting force. And basically, yeah, you're facing off against a lot of enemies. Granted, many of the other Crimean knights, including the force led by Joffrey, will show up to help you out. But you're also facing off against a warrior with a bowgun and snipers with crossbows. And they can be very difficult. Even Ludwig's difficult to face off against. So you have to use a very specific tactics, which I think everyone can find a specific tactic to defeat this guy. And what are you gonna have after this? Elincia just lets Lucia hang, and this leads the Need Grail mercenaries to rescue her. What the heck? Just brings up so many questions. This will be continued in part 2. Wait a second. If Macbeth basically causes bad things to happen, what will happen to this